You ever notice how there's a point where things don't necessarily fall apart, but they stop making sense in the way they used to? Like the same conversations keep happening, but they feel thinner somehow. Like you're hearing the words, but also hearing something underneath them, something mechanical. Like people are running scripts they didn't write. And maybe you are too, and it's not even unsettling at first, it's just noticeable. Like a hum in a room you didn't realize was there until it stops. Except in this case, it doesn't stop. It gets clearer. In a world full of noise, trust the signal. If you're hearing this, you've already found it. This is Dove and Serpent Radio. Stay with me. I was thinking the other day about how strange it is that people assume clarity is comforting. Like if you finally figure things out, you'll feel better. But most of the time it's the opposite. Clarity makes things harder because now you can see where you've been going along with something that doesn't actually fit. And it's not dramatic. It's not like a movie where everything explodes. It's more like realizing you've been wearing a shirt that doesn't quite fit. And now that you've noticed it, you can't unfeel it. And you can keep wearing it. You probably will for a while. But it's different now. There was a story I saw, one of those late night scrolling kind of things. Could have been real, could have been completely fabricated. It said a town in Nevada reported hearing a low frequency hum for 3 consecutive nights. Not loud enough to record clearly, but loud enough that people couldn't sleep. And some even described it as familiar, which is the part that stuck with me. Not eerie, not threatening, but just familiar. Like something they had heard before but couldn't place, And officials came out and said it was probably atmospheric pressure changes or distant machinery or something like that. Yeah, maybe it was. But what interested me was how quickly people accepted the explanation just to make it go away. Not the sound, but the meaning of it. That's how most things work. You don't actually need the explanation to be right, you just need it to be sufficient to close the loop so you can move on. And once the loop is closed, you stop looking, even if something in you knows there's more to it. It's like animals, You ever look into how certain animals behave right before something changes in their environment? Like birds going quiet all at once, or deer freezing and staring into nothing. Not reacting to what's there, but to something that hasn't arrived yet. And scientists will say it's sensitivity to pressure changes or electromagnetic shifts or whatever, which it probably is, it's probably true. But it still leaves that strange gap between what they detect and what we dismiss. Because we don't trust anything we can't immediately categorize. And space is like that too, in a much bigger way, I guess, because when you really think about it, not casually, but actually sit with it, space doesn't behave the way your mind wants it to. Time doesn't either. You've got regions where time moves differently depending on gravity, meaning there are places where if you stood there long enough and came back, you'd be out of sync with everything you knew. which sounds like science fiction until you realize it's just physics. And then it becomes more unsettling because it's real, and we just don't feel it happening, which is probably the only reason we're able to function at all. And that might be the pattern underneath all of this, the idea that most of reality is happening in ways you don't directly perceive. And every once in a while something slips through. Not enough to fully understand it, just enough to disrupt your sense that everything is stable and known and fixed. I remember sitting in a parking lot once, not for any dramatic reason, just not wanting to go inside yet. And there was this weird moment where it felt like if I opened the door, I'd be stepping back into something I had already outgrown. Not in a big life-changing way, just subtly. Like the version of me that belonged in that building had already started to dissolve. And I sat there long enough to realize nothing was actually stopping me. There was no external force, no locked door, no consequence waiting, just hesitation. And hesitation feels like a lot. It feels like being stuck until you look at it closely. And that's when it flips. Because once you realize you're hesitating, not trapped, the whole structure changes. Because hesitation implies movement is possible, it just hasn't happened yet. There's another story I saw, probably fake again, about a deep-sea research team that picked up what they described as patterned sound bursts, miles below the surface, not whale calls, not mechanical noise, something with repetition but no identifiable source. And they recorded it and sent it off and never really, got a follow-up on it or anything, or at least not publicly. And, you read something like that and your first instinct is to dismiss it, because what else are you supposed to do? But there's always that second layer, the one that goes quiet and just files it away. Because you don't need to believe something for it to register. And that's kind of how internal changes work too. You don't fully believe it at first. You don't immediately act on it. You just register it like a signal that came through clearly enough that you couldn't ignore it, but not clearly enough to fully understand it. And then life continues. Conversations continue. Routines continue. But there's a difference now. There's a layer of observation that wasn't there before, like you're watching yourself participate in something you used to be fully immersed in. And you can still play the part, you probably do, but there's distance. And distance is the beginning of transformation, whether you want it to be or not. I think that's why people get uncomfortable when things start to shift internally. Not because anything external has changed yet, but because the internal alignment is off. And once that happens, everything else starts to feel slightly artificial. Like you're moving through a set that hasn't caught up to the script change. There's a species of octopus that can mimic not just the color but the behavior of other animals, flattening itself to look like a flounder or curling into shapes that resemble sea snakes. And what's interesting isn't just the mimicry, it's how convincing it is to other species. Like they fully accept the illusion because it matches what they expect to see. And that's not that different from how people interact. Most of the time, we're not verifying reality. We're matching patterns. And when the pattern breaks, even slightly, that's when things get strange. Not in an obvious way, not in a way you can point to and say, this is it. Just in that quiet, persistent sense that something underneath the surface has shifted and isn't going back. So if you've been feeling that low-level signal, that sense that something isn't quite right, but you can't fully articulate why, that's not a problem to solve immediately. It's something to notice. Because noticing is where everything starts. Not action, not decisions, just awareness. And once awareness is there, it doesn't disappear. It might fade into the background for a while. You might override it, distract yourself, explain it away, but it's still there waiting. Like that hum people heard in the desert, or like something familiar you can't quite place. Something that doesn't need to be loud to be real. Sometimes I think about how strange it is that clocks exist at all. Like we all agreed to slice something invisible into equal pieces and pretend that gives us control over it. And you can feel it, when you wake up before your alarm, that moment where time feels soft, undefined, like it hasn't hardened into minutes yet. And then the alarm goes off and suddenly everything snaps back into structure. Like the world remembered what it's supposed to be doing, There was a report I came across, again, could be nothing, could be everything, about a lighthouse that had been decommissioned years ago, suddenly broadcasting again on a frequency that no longer existed in any official registry. And a few amateur radio operators picked it up late one night, just static at first, then what sounded like a voice repeating something indistinct. And by morning it was gone, and the official explanation was interference, overlapping signals, the usual. But nobody ever tracked down the source. And that's always the part that lingers, not the event itself, but the lack of closure around it. It's like when you forget why you walked into a room. You don't question the room, you question yourself. Even though for a split second it feels like the room shifted, like you crossed into something slightly misaligned, and your intention didn't carry over properly. And maybe that's all it is, just a lapse in memory. But it's a very specific kind of disorientation. It feels bigger than that. I read somewhere that elephants can sense distant storms through vibrations in the ground, like miles away, long before anything is visible. And they start moving before there's any obvious reason to. And I always wonder what that would feel like from the inside, to know something is coming without knowing what it is. Just that the ground itself is telling you to go, There's a particular kind of silence, right, that only happens late at night. It's not the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation. Like the world isn't asking anything of you in that moment. And your thoughts start to stretch out a little further than they normally would. And you can follow them without interruption. And sometimes they go somewhere useful, and sometimes they don't. But either way, there's something different about how they move. There was a story about a man who claimed he saw the same stranger in 3 different cities over the course of a week. Not someone who looked similar, the same person, same clothes, same expression, just standing in different places, as if he had always been there. And by the third time, he started to feel like he was the one being observed, like the pattern wasn't random anymore. And of course, there's no way to verify something like that. It could be coincidence, misrecognition, but it's the feeling of it that sticks, that sense of being inside something you don't fully understand. Time is strange, though, in that way, because we experience it as a straight line, but everything we know about it suggests that it doesn't actually behave that way. It bends, stretches, slows down, speeds up depending on where you are and how fast you're moving, which means that the version of you right now isn't perfectly aligned with the version of you a moment ago, even if it feels continuous. And that continuity might just be something your mind constructs to keep things stable. I think about animals a lot, how most of them don't seem to struggle with identity the way we do. They don't sit there wondering if they're on the right path or if they're wasting their time. They respond, they move, they adapt. And maybe that's because they're closer to whatever signal we've layered over with language and expectation and narrative. Or maybe they're just operating within a narrower range, and we're the ones dealing with the side effects of having too much awareness. There was an article about a species of jellyfish that can essentially revert to an earlier stage of its life cycle instead of dying, just resetting itself under the right conditions. And people like to call it biologically immortal. But that's a strange kind of immortality, not continuing forward but looping back, starting over again and again. And it makes you wonder how many things in nature are less linear than we assume. I had a moment once where I couldn't remember a word I used all the time, just completely gone. And for a few seconds it felt like language itself had slipped, like the connection between thought and expression had loosened just enough to notice it. And then it came back and everything was normal again. But those little glitches are interesting because they show you how much of your experience depends on systems you don't consciously control. There's a kind of bird that can mimic chainsaws and camera shutters and car alarms, not just copying the sound, but integrating it into its own calls. And other birds respond to it as if it's natural, which says something about how perception works, how easily something artificial can become part of the environment if it's consistent enough. And consistency is convincing. That's probably one of the most reliable patterns there is. If something repeats often enough, you stop questioning it. You accept it as part of the background, whether it makes sense or not. There was a rumor, never confirmed, about a stretch of highway where drivers reported losing small amounts of time. Not hours, not anything dramatic, just a few minutes unaccounted for. Arriving slightly earlier than expected with no memory of a particular segment of the drive. And it's easy to dismiss as inattention or zoning out or something, but it's interesting how common that kind of experience actually is. It's not usually noticed or documented. Sometimes I think awareness isn't something that turns on all at once, but something that flickers. Like you're more awake in certain moments and less in others. And the goal isn't to stay fully aware all the time, which might not even be possible or desirable, but to recognize when it happens and not immediately cover it up. There's a comfort in routines, obviously, but there's also kind of inertia there, and inertia doesn't feel like resistance while you're inside of it. It just feels like normal, until something shifts and you realize you've been moving in a very specific pattern for a long time. And I read about how certain deep-sea creatures generate their own light. Not because it's useful in the way we think of it, but because that's just how they exist in an environment where external light doesn't reach. And it made me think about how much of what we do is just adapting to conditions we didn't choose. Developing internal systems to navigate external darkness. And then you come back into something simple, like sitting in a room and noticing the way your thoughts move when you're not actively directing them, how they jump, circle, repeat, and drift, and occasionally land somewhere that feels unexpectedly clear, like you stumbled onto something without trying. That might be the signal or part of it, not something external cutting through the noise, but something internal that becomes noticeable when the noise drops just enough. And maybe that's why it shows up at night more often, when everything else quiets down and there's space for it to surface. Not louder, just more obvious. Keep that signal close. You've been listening to Dove and Serpent Radio.